What's going on, everybody? We have a very special episode for you today. We're going to be delving into the world of baseball and all of the new advanced analytics that come with it. They might be a little bit confusing, they might be a little bit daunting, but we're going to go into them, what they mean, and all that good stuff. And we have a special guest with you today, our new buddy Dylan with the Drummey Angle. What's going on, buddy?
What's up, guys? I'm glad you can have me.
Absolutely welcome, man. And as always, we got Brooklyn here, the duo that you've known to love and hate. What's going on, buddy?
I'm doing good, man. Pleasure to have you, Dylan. And I'm ready to get into this. I don't really know too much about like the advanced analytic world of baseball. It's a whole nother universe when you start looking at that. Goes really, really deep. So it's gonna be fun to get a little taste of somebody with a lot of knowledge of it. And hopefully he spreads that knowledge to us and you guys. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and what I kind of read about with the site is our goal is to actually spread sabermetric knowledge in easy to understand fashion. We want regular fans, we want casual fans to be able to get into sabermetrics more easily, and I'm glad I can at least have this platform to just explain to you guys just some of the more advanced metrics and an easy way. I mean, our goal is for people to understand baseball better. And I think if people can understand baseball better, they can appreciate the sport more, which I think every baseball fan hopes to do.
Exactly. And you and I kind of started talking last week, and I saw your channel or your Instagram page, and I was like, that's literally exactly the type of content that I would love to talk about because it is something that we talk a lot about baseball on our show. Obviously, we do every sport, but we're getting closer to just baseball season, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our fans, for the most part, are guys who maybe don't know what DRS is or exactly what WRC plus is. So we're gonna get into that.
Right.
What is let's just dive right into it. What are one of the stats of these sabermetrics that you look at like right away? Like, what are your eyes are going to this when you're looking at a player profile, kind of right away?
I mean, it's pretty basic, right? I feel like, but war is something that I immediately look at because while it's a conglomerate stat. It tells you in a frank sense how many wins a player is estimated to produce. And so there are two types of war, or actually there are more, but generally two consensus types of war are baseball reference war and Fangraphs and baseball prospectus has their own thing, but I'm just going to focus on those two. And both of these, they calculate different things and whatnot, and they both have different measures. But I generally go for Fangraphs war because I feel like it accounts for more. But basically, that's the first thing that I generally look at, especially when telling me about a player, because there are different types of stats as far as you want to look at predictive measures or do you want to look at like describing measures. And when I'm looking at a stat to describe a player, war is pretty tell all as far as what it's able to do and how it's able to articulate value in a defined sense that we can just see on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and you mentioned the two different types. Um, what are the exact differences between the two?
So it's a little cloudy because so technically war is this thing called a black box stat, right? So we can't actually calculate it ourselves, which is a big worry within the sabermetric community, but it's worth noting as far as we don't have the formula for either war. It's not out there. We can't calculate it ourselves in that fashion. We could try to create our own metric of it that's public, but Baseball Reference and Fangraphs have that as proprietary data and proprietary info. So but a big difference is so they calculate hitting value a little differently just as far as what they value in certain things, what metrics they use, what data analytics sites that they're borrowing data from. That's a lot what differs. And I know a big thing is Fangraphs for, especially for catchers, a big thing is Fangraphs calculates for catch framing. If you guys are familiar with that at all, a
Yep.
catcher can earn runs based on their ability to create strikes and confuse an umpire. And so Fangraphs calculates for that we absolutely know of, and Baseball Reference does not. And there's a whole other spew of differences that are kind of vague, and I don't think it's necessarily needed to get into, but they
Okay.
are definitely different, and they each have their value.
Yeah, and we're kind of in a weird gray area right now where um, framing is really, really important as of right now. Obviously, like you look at teams like ours, the New York Yankees, who opt to ditch the high ceiling offensive catcher for guys who really don't have any ceiling at all in terms of offense, but are elite or have been elite throughout their career for framing. And it's kind of interesting to see that, like, the we don't care about the offense. Let's get us defensive runs, like you mentioned. But with potentially uh, automated umpires coming out in a year or two, maybe never, whenever that might happen, if it does,
Hopefully.
that might just not be a thing, which is kind of interesting that a pretty significant difference in the war might just be gone.
Oh, I mean, 100%. Yeah. I mean, teams are valuing. I mean, war can come from all places, right? As far as it can come from defense, come from offense, come from base running. It's it varies. So I mean, a lot of teams are starting to see more, especially at in the past 5 years, are starting to see more value in defensive ability because we're able to articulate it more clearly. Defense, like out of any thing of sabermetrics, is probably the most behind area. So what we're aiming to do with that is that we're trying to make it to where it's not. We're trying to make defense and the ability for a fielder to field more calculated. We're trying to be able to put it in a better number. And previously we weren't able to do that, but as teams are more able to do so, they're going to start valuing it a lot more. And you see that with the Yankees moves.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
pretty interesting too, because you look at guys who have like high errors, right? Um, Fernando Tatis Jr., for example, right? A guy who at shortstop has made a lot of errors in his young career already, but they're gonna keep plugging him in at shortstop because they kind of understand that these errors are not actually as detrimental as like an error on the score sheet might suggest, just because of how they occur and that type of situation. And that's only something we'd be able to understand with these kind of advanced stats.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, I've gone under this a little bit on the blog, but I'm happy. It's you look at a lot of the conventional fielding statistics, and truthfully, they are horrendous at telling you what actually happened. They're horrendous at assigning blame to who actually deserves it. So I mean, a guy with a high amount of errors can still be a good fielder. If the error, I mean, if the errors are generally like not very highly looked upon and whatnot. But it's, you know, I feel like the errors in there, and Fernando Tatis is not a great fielder, I'll admit.
Yeah.
But even though they are able to articulate value, when you can hit like that, when you can hit at his level, it more than compensates.
Yeah, absolutely. Brooke, do you have any defensive type of questions like that or anything?
So how do they measure like whether it's on, let's say, Tatis or the first baseman's fault of the error? How would that be measured and shown?
So it definitely depends. So a lot of this, it gets into a lot more advanced data because it comes into the statcast era, to where they track every individual player's movement exactly with cameras and whatnot. And so when they're able to do that, and they're able to track the average of what an expected fielder should do in that situation. They're able to create more of a median, or what a player should live up to. And when they're able to do that, if say Fernando Tatis doesn't do what's expected of the median fielder, then they can properly assign blame. Okay, he didn't do his job that play. He missed it by X feet this way and Y feet that way. And if they're able to see that and calculate what the difference is between those and the outs that he did not make, they can articulate his value from that.
Yeah,
Is
and
there
so
like
that
a baseline number that would for somebody to look at and say, okay, at zero you're solid, and then obviously above or below.
Yeah, absolutely. So So when you look at Baseball Savant or any of the other public information, you'll see a lot of them have stats that have a zero baseline. So zero goes out as the major league average. So when you see a player, it's zero will be not good, will be not be better than the average, not be worse. It'll be that benchmark and say like outs above average. If that's one stat that's big now. So if you take outs above average, if a player has, it'll everybody will start at zero because they all technically start out as average before the season starts. But as it goes on and whatnot, and they start measuring what the average fielder should be expected to do in that situation, they'll be able to see, okay, this guy has 6 outs above average and whatnot. And a couple players do thus far, I'm pretty sure, but that's kind of how they're starting out with a normalized basis.
Cool. So you mentioned outs above average. What's like is there another particular defensive stat you like to look at? Because I know there's a lot, and some kind of build off of others. Like UZR used to be the one, and now we're kind of moving all away from that a little bit, I think.
And yeah, absolutely. That's a great point to circle back to because that goes back to that black box stats that I was mentioning you, how there's not a public thing. So UZR was invented by Michael Lightman, and he's a really good sabermetrician, but it's also a problem because we don't know everything that's going into it, how he's calculating it, and some people have suggested that there are some flaws within the stat just based on movements and the numbers that we can see publicly. So people are starting to get away from that private black box area of Lightman, and I'm not sure what his company is called, but they generally provided info to Fangraphs and whatnot for a lot of these defensive analysis, and so that's why people, when they started seeing the shortcomings, they're like, okay, we maybe need to shift to outs above average because kind of know what more can go into this. We kind of know how it's calculated easier, and it appears to be less flawed from some of the stress tests that have undergone it. But defense, it's defense is definitely, like, in my personal opinion, and I feel like a lot of Saber metrics guys would agree, is probably the hardest to measure out of any aspect of the sport. It's really hard to measure defense. There are so many variables in play, and it takes a lot of data to correctly value a guy.
Yeah, and it's a lot harder than offense as well, just because offense, if you really wanted to make it simple, did he hit the ball? Yes, no. Cool. Like if you wanted to go fully bare bones. And defense, you just I guess you could do did he make the play, but how hard was the ball hit and like
Yeah.
what position was he at? Those types of things come into a factor, and it does get tough. So it is nice to see some stats coming out to try and help paint a picture, despite how good of a picture it might be.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there are just infinite. There are just a lot more possibilities on defense. You have think about it. You got one guy at the plate who's hitting a ball over the field. Now times that basically by, I mean, times that by 9. Honestly, times that
Yeah.
by 9, and that, I mean, that's the possibilities you have of a given fielder given a certain play on a certain ball and whatnot. I mean, and that's not exactly how you would articulate it, but it's kind of my general point is that just defense is just so hard to value, and we're getting and sabermetricians and really smart people in front offices are working really hard to try to correctly value this stuff.
People way smarter than me, I'll tell you that. They get paid the big bucks specifically for
Yeah.
that, and I get to enjoy it. You
That's
get to
facts.
absolutely enjoy it.
Absolutely.
Go into offense though. A stat that I really like, and you tell me if it's something that you like. But when we've kind of talked about guys, one thing that I've really liked is weighted runs created, and so WRC plus is the shorthand of that. It's like you were mentioning earlier with a stat being rounded at zero being the average, except this one is 100. And I kind of like those 100 averages because you can kind of see like, oh, it's 100. Oh, this guy's at a 65. He stinks. And it's just like kind of quick.
Yeah.
There's one less number there. Nice. But I've really enjoyed this stat just because it's showing that not necessarily you as a singular player are performing well, but it's kind of more towards team wins as well because you're creating runs and runs directly correlate to wins. So it's definitely something that
Mhm.
I've liked coming
Yeah,
up,
it's
but
yeah, weighted runs created plus is a great metric that I use a lot. I think it really truthfully does have value. It started around the Pete Palmer, Bill James era to where they were trying to correctly have give value to players that were actually making runs, right? Like we look at RBIs and whatnot, and I can go on my RBI rant all day and how I'm not a big RBI fan personally, but they're trying to correctly assign blame, right? Like going back to that defensive point, they're correctly assigning blame, giving credit to those who deserve it and those who do not. And that's what weighted runs created plus does. So weighted runs created is actually a stat in itself, right? Before weighted runs created plus. But when you add the plus and whatnot, it becomes more park adjusted and it evens out for all the different run environments across the game. As you guys know, different stadiums have a lot different run production, say comparing Oracle Park, who is one of the most pitcher friendly stadiums in the majors, and Coors Field, who, they
the
just
ball
goes
flies.
everywhere there. But it's so when they adjust for all that and whatnot, you get weighted runs created plus. And so when you get that type of stuff and you get those metrics that can cleanly tell you the value these guys are actually bringing to their team, I love it. And that kind of relates to weighted runs created plus and weighted on base average. If you guys are familiar with WOBA, at all. I'm not sure if you guys are or not, but it was a stat invented by Tom Tango, and basically the goal of the metric was to actually give players assign a numerical value and numerical weight to each individual part of the game as far as what a hitter can do, like single, double, triple, home run, because slugging saying a home run is 4 times as valuable as a single is just not true. So when you try to correctly articulate that value with stats like this, you're going to get a lot more accurate metrics that just lead to for people to know actually what happened, which is the whole goal of SaberMetrics, right? Getting people to know what actually happened in the game.
And it's really interesting that a stat can take different ballparks into account because, like you said, with Coors Field, you look at players like DJ LeMahieu, Trevor Story, Charlie Blackmon, who they ball out at Coors Field and then they come to another ballpark and their stats tend to dip a little bit. They go to another team, fans and people are going to be like, they're probably not going to produce as much. So how do they take the ballpark into account? And in what way do the numbers show, like, okay, this stadium is detrimental to this guy's stats. If he hits anywhere else, they're not going to really correlate as well. How does that all play out?
Oh, that's a great question. So basically, how they do that generally, and this will be more of a general idea of it, is so that they take each individual. They take, sorry,
You're good.
they take the run factor. So basically, each ballpark has something that's called a park factor. They
Hmm.
measure the amount of runs produced for each ballpark, and they put it on that same 100 scale. One is it's technically one, but one is average. Anything below one is below average. Anything above is has a lot more runs. So Coors Field traditionally has one of the highest rates of a ballpark factor just because the air, I think they said when I did an article back on it, it was probably over a year ago, but I'm pretty sure I remember a ball is estimated to travel roughly 10 to 11% farther just based on the sea level there. And I know personally from my, like, I got to visit Coors Field. That altitude is no joke, and it definitely it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense that I can fly there. But so when a ball is able to do that, and when they can correctly get the run value for each stadium, they can adjust. So if a guy say if their run factor is 1.39, right, and a player has half of their games there, they can take those 81 games and they can adjust them to where it would be okay, like just doing some inverse mathematics for how you would say this guy hit this. Let's times it by the corrected park factor, and they would get those metrics like weighted runs created plus and whatnot that adjust for that.
So it adjusts it to a one. Is that right? Like it adjusts it to
Oh
make everything.
yeah. It's basically adjusting to the park factor
Okay.
being one. Yes, of
Okay.
the average.
That's really
Getting to the
cool.
average.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, the same goes for the opposite for the guys who are in pitcher friendly ballparks. If a
Yeah.
player isn't producing as well and the run environment in the league is not as good, that's also another factor in it. So they also take the run environment in the entire major leagues into account as far as that goes, which differs from year to year. So they take the average hitter part of it also with a number of things. They do a lot. They do a
Yeah.
lot to get these metrics and make sure they're accurate. So getting those, like for example, a lot of guys will have a lot lower of an OPS this year, say, but their weighted runs created plus will still be like, what they were last
Their
year.
career
And that's
average, or more or less, right?
yeah, because hitters are doing horrendously
Worse.
this year, just as a whole. And I mean, partially due to dead ball, but that's another tangent. But it's when you get those things into account, they can really get those metrics that account for that and adjust.
Yeah, and not to pivot too hard, but you did mention the
Absolutely,
deadened balls, and I do want to talk about that for a second because
absolutely.
I don't know if this is something that you have noticed as well, or you and your people that you have in your corner have talked about, but it feels like the deadened balls have been swapped out, right? The last 2 3 weeks, it feels like a lot more hitters are seemingly, like, I haven't looked at numbers, so I could be completely wrong on this, but it seems like a lot more hitters that were struggling are figuring it out, and now balls are starting to leave. I've seen a lot more home runs. There was 2 3 home run games in the last like 36 hours. Um, do you have any kind of thoughts on like the switching out, or do you think they're still dead, or why were they dead to begin with? There's a lot to kind of talk about with those, but
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it's hard to articulate now because there's such limited data regarding the last couple of weeks, right? It's a very small sample size. One thing about SaberMetrics that you really have to value is sample size. A lot of things need time. Baseball is not one of those sports to where you're getting a guy in a I mean truthfully, right? I mean, I feel like the NBA has more true outcomes of what's supposed to happen compared to baseball in a 7 game series. The better, a lot of time, you have a lot less margin for error, say in the NBA or even the NFL in a set. I mean, if you put them all in a 7 game series compared to the MLB.
the best team
So,
will win more times than not.
yeah, the best team generally will win a lot more in those sports than baseball in my personal opinion, just based because baseball needs sample size, and that's one thing about the dead balls is that we need more time to adjust, and we need to know whether it's pitchers because that's one thing. There has been pitcher dominance that has been going on forever, and so I feel like the baseball. I'm in agreement that the baseball was definitely deadened to an extent. You were getting a lot of the launch angles and the exit velocities that just weren't going as far, and it didn't make sense. And the only impact would have been a deadened baseball. So I feel like the baseball was deadened. Whether they were switched out is truly up in the air. I feel like it would be good for the sport, and I feel like offense is way down right now to record lows in the past like 50 years. So I definitely think that if once we get more time, and I feel like it'd be better for the league. So I would definitely be on the
Absolutely.
watch for that, and I could see a switch out happening as MLB has demonstrated they are willing to do mid-season
Yeah.
based on some of the preliminary findings from some of those reports. So I would be on the lookout for it, but I think the data is not conclusive right now.
Okay.
Yeah,
Based
and then I feel like MLB would just blame it on, oh, it's a shortened spring training, so players come into the year, they're not really hitting as well, so obviously offense is down. My whole thing is, if they switch it, whatever, you guys are weird, do it. Don't switch it again when it comes playoff time, because we saw in the past that it seemed like that happened, and
yeah,
it was just a
I
bad
mean,
outcome.
absolutely. I will admit I like just based on some of the findings, the shortened spring training does have an impact on player
Of
performance.
course.
There
Of
is
course.
definitely a correlation there. So I want to consider that as far as part of it. And I mean that's what happened in 2020 with a lot of the guys, but that was a whole nother basket of eggs. But
Yeah.
it will generally have, but it shouldn't have had this big of an effect. And that's why I personally, and that's why when I've parsed through all the data and have checked everything, I feel like there definitely was a dead end ball. But I definitely feel like it would be better for the sport, like just as far as a personal opinion, right? That they reverted to a more springy ball that had a little more offense, especially this pitcher dominance that's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
wouldn't you like it if you finally squared up a ball? It did something when the guy on the mound is who's a great like Kenley Jansen just throwing a demon cutter, and you finally square it up and it doesn't break your bat, and now it just goes nowhere because the ball has less tightness on the thread. I don't know, whatever they did to the balls, whatever it might have been.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what they did. I don't think a lot of
No
people
idea.
are very
No,
sure
no
except
idea.
the commissioner's office, but yeah, it definitely we're supposed to, baseball and something I appreciate, and that's why I like SaberMetrics is it's a meritocracy, right? You're trying to award blame and you're trying to award reward basically when players do good and players do bad. So if they have underlying numbers that support, a home run, then they should really be earning that. And there are a lot of implications financially and otherwise when they
Yeah.
can't. And
Yeah.
expected run values and expected metrics are not right when they don't have when the balls are adjusted to where X ball hit should be a home run, but it's not. So I definitely think it should be more in line with what's regularly expected as far as out of a hitter doing said thing to get said result.
Yeah, and then another thing that could come into account, they try to do something where they keep all the balls at like 11 level playing field across all 30 ballparks, where they added humidors to each and every single stadium, which they wanted to do before the COVID season, but they
Mm-hmm.
finally did it. So maybe that could possibly have any sort of implications on the balls, on top of the shortened spring training, on top of them being deadened and all that, because maybe the balls weren't like reacting well to whatever temperature and moisture they have in the humidor. So that could possibly be a thing as well.
It's possible. Absolutely. It's a very scientific process, and you
Yeah.
have a lot of smart scientists who are aware with what the weather can do in certain environments. So I that definitely is something that could have happened as far as the humidors or something is not right or they're doing something or they could be switching the balls. That's another
Yeah.
thing too that's like that they admitted to openly last season is that some of the balls were different for other series. So that still could be happening now. I don't
Yeah.
want to rule it out. I don't have the data to support that, and I'm generally against making claims like that. But I wouldn't. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but I wouldn't rule it out just
No,
based
not
on
at all.
prior evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something you mentioned in one of your like spiels was that it affects people like financially, and it's kind of really interesting to think about how the Statcast era has only been since 2015, so we've had about a little over 7 years of having these advanced stats with all the cameras and everything to tell us a better version of the story, and it's kind of hard not to think back as to how many guys might have benefited as baseball players. How many great baseball players never got a true opportunity because they were Joey Gallo in the 70s, so they hit for 130. They didn't get an opportunity to hit the ball at Coors Field or wherever it might have been. So it is really interesting to kind of go back. And there's a guy who I always look at, who people regarded him as a great player in general, but if Gary Sheffield played baseball now, would be absolutely elite just because he was constantly walking. He had a lot of home
Yeah.
runs, and he did strike out a lot, but his stats would just represent so much better now. Is there anybody that kind of comes to mind to you for that?
I mean, yeah, there were definitely a load of players. I mean, you got to look at. I mean, not in specific. Oh God, I can't say that word. Specifically, I was gonna try. Yeah, I'm just gonna specifically. I mean, not particularly. I just think that there are types of players that specifically come to mind. So high strikeout guys, right? Like strikeout used to be. I mean, it's still to some degree looked at as an immortal sin. It's. I mean, like people look at strikeouts like, oh my gosh, they're the end of the world. And when you look at the expected difference between a strikeout, a lot of times in a regular, just poorly hit ground ball, it's very different. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like it depends on the situation. If you got a guy, if you have no man on or a guy at third or even a guy at second. I mean, or just one random base runner that's not at first, or no force out opportunity. Sure, I'd rather have a ground ball over a strikeout because it's proven in run expectancies that you're kind of score more runs on a ground ball than a strikeout there. But when you have a force out or something like that, or a situation like that, a strikeout and a ground ball are not very different. So I mean, guys that struck out a lot and were looked at as horrible players would definitely be viewed better. Guys who walk a lot, right? Like people didn't value walks. I mean, to a degree that like they viewed it as more on the pitcher than the hitter. They looked at it as less of a hitter skill than a pitcher flaw. So a guy who's able to walk is actually very skillful. And that's something that guys who were able to get a lot of walks and create those true outcomes of, walk, home run, or whatnot, and the people who are also able to have a lot of additional power. I mean, and then you have some guys, right, that when you put under conventional like looks and whatnot, or even sabermetric looks, like you look at anything Babe Ruth did, like as far as that, the Great Bambino is considered the greatest of all time, and you look at a lot of his sabermetrics, and he's justified. He's one of the best players of all time based on his time period. So you look at a lot of guys that are justified by it, and then just as equally, you get a lot of guys that because of sabermetrics, they're like, "Wow, this guy was really highly valued, and he sucked." Frankly, so I mean, it's not like I said, not specifically, but there are definitely types of players that benefited and types of players that didn't in this new day and age.
Is there anybody that falls into that sucked category that you just mentioned that you know of?
Crap. I mean,
There's plenty,
there's a
obviously, but
couple. So, I mean, when I did my all-time rankings, right? I did an all-time ranking for my page a little bit with a collab with another guy on Instagram, and you got a lot of players. I want to say there's a couple that just didn't make it. I feel like Nolan Ryan didn't rank as good. A lot of people call him one of the best pitchers of all time. And when I was running some of my stuff as far as looking at their WAR and a couple of other Hall of Fame stats, he didn't rank as well as I thought he would, just based on whatnot. And he was a great pitcher, but I wouldn't venture to call him the best pitcher of all time or even close, frankly. I mean, I think he may be borderline top 10 is and there's a lot of guys like that when you look at the sabermetric data, you get more telling of the actual value that they were able to produce. So I mean, don't get me wrong, and I don't want to disparage Nolan Ryan by anything. I love Nolan Ryan. I think he was a great player. But I just think as far as some people saying consensusly that he is the best pitcher of all time is just somewhat inaccurate.
Probably just because of how dominant he was.
yeah.
Everybody
Yeah, yeah,
in that era seeing him just throw heat like that, they don't know what's coming. They can't hit that.
and absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that's another factor. And you also got to consider that a harder part about a lot of these older guys that maybe were missing something, and I can acknowledge a flaw in possibly my own system or sabermetric systems in general, is we didn't have StatCast data or PitchFX data, which was the private version of StatCast that wasn't as advanced beforehand. So we didn't have that data to tell us, okay, this guy may, their regular, what the stats say he produced may not be as good, but the measures of his movement on his pitches are some of the deadliest we have ever seen in MLB history. And that's something we could consider. Like, if we had that data, which we don't because we had no way to measure it. So, I mean, it's it's hard, right? It's hard valuing those old guys. You can make a lot of assumptions, and based on those assumptions, that's where it got with Nolan Ryan and a couple other guys. But it's just, you don't have a lot of that data that you need to make an 100% accurate stance. And I mean, that's most sabermetrics on old players, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. And like how cool would it be to be able to go back in time and see the complete movement on old pitches that don't really exist anymore? Like a screwball, like Fernando Valenzuela comes in and he's throwing his screwball. How cool would it be to see the actual drop and the left and right movement of that pitch? And it'll be really nice, but obviously we
Yeah,
can't.
I remember when I was little and I read these like baseball books. It was the And Me series or something like that. I
Yes,
forget.
yes,
Yeah, you read those. Nice.
yes, I
Okay.
did.
Yeah, I love those books when I was little. Like, I haven't read them in a while, but I love those books. And I remember the one that vividly sticks out to me is the Satchel Paige one. I
Yeah.
remember, and I'm like, it was hard because so when I was doing my all time rankings, I basically me and my team ultimately made the decision is that we cut out steroid players and Negro League players, and that's
Okay.
because we thought the data was incomplete. I didn't think we had concise data on these guys to what they actually did in their careers. So when we cut those guys out, it was hard because Satchel Paige may well have been one of the best pitchers of all time in comparison to where he did. We don't have the data, and if we did, that would be just amazing because I remember that guy. It was like I think what happened was they brought back a pitch gun or something if I'm correct. I read this a long time ago and the gun broke, which is kind of the ironic part is it conveniently broke when they were trying to calculate how hard he threw, and but it's to where it would be really nice to be able to see those stats and to value those guys properly. And it's something that's somewhat sad when we're trying to value the overall value these players in comparison to modern players, and we ultimately are unable to completely incorrectly.
Yeah, I saw a really funny a meme the other day, and it was about those books, and it was it was like if you read the and B's, like the Honus and me, Jackie and me, you're now in a room looking up Statcast, and I was
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's funny that
very.
you brought that up because I saw that like yesterday, and I'm like,
Yeah, I love those books. I
they
mean,
were
that
awesome.
was definitely a big part of my childhood.
I'll definitely say too, like I've always been into baseball, right? Well, I grew up a
Mm.
Yankee fan, all that. And it's kind of easier to be super into baseball growing up in the late '90s, early 2000s as a Yankee fan. Like it's kind of easy. Um,
Yeah.
but I remember reading those books in, I think elementary school, and I was like, wow, this like baseball is really cool. And it's definitely something I attribute to liking it as much as I do now. So shout out to whoever wrote those books. I don't remember the author, but big
I
shout out.
don't remember it. I don't remember it either. I mean, I'll probably look it up after this just because I'm curious. But but yeah, they were great. I love them.
I think he's looking it up right now.
Yeah.
Are you okay? Okay, yeah. I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious though, because I feel like it was somebody I've read other than that too. I felt like it
No,
wasn't an author
they're
who.
really good books, and I remember just being a kid and be like, oh, Abner Doubleday invented baseball. I would have never
Yeah,
known that. I would have just
yeah.
never
Well,
known that.
and that's been a big debate, right? Like
As if he
Abner
even did.
Doubleday inventing baseball, it looks less and less likely as data and historians truthfully look at the records, and it looks a lot less and less likely. But that story was really nice.
Yeah,
It was
exactly.
a really nice
And
story.
it's
I
like
mean,
if that is the story of it, cool. And if not,
and
that's okay too. But
And I mean, that's a lot of things in baseball too. I mean, I kind of mentioned this before when we were scheduling this, is like Moneyball. Like I was talking about Moneyball. It's the movie and the book, both amazing stories, but not a lot of credit assigned to the right guys who deserved it. Like they didn't. The movie didn't mention Miguel Tejada, if I'm correct,
Tahada.
once. If I
Tahada.
want to Tejada, sorry.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. If They didn't mention him once. He won the MVP that year. They didn't mention Barry Zito. They mentioned Chad Bradford, which don't get me wrong, Bradford did great for the team. Far from the most valuable player. So and I love baseball stories like that because they create that love for the game. And Moneyball is still like my top 5 movies of all time. So that's nothing against it, but it's definitely separating the stories are great and they do great at promoting the game and promoting the awesomeness of the game. But sometimes they definitely take liberty in mixing fact with fiction
Yeah.
Yeah.
or just
And real quick, Dan Gutman.
Dan Gutman.
Dan
Yeah.
Gutman. Gee, dang. Okay, he was that was okay. That makes me feel better. Just knowing that honestly because I was genuinely curious.
Shout out to Dan.
Shout
Yep.
out
Dan
Dan
Gutman getting plenty of people around our age really into baseball. So big shout
Absolutely.
out. Did you bring up Moneyball too? It's kind of funny that they don't mention Miguel Tejada, yet if you talk to an A's fan or a baseball fan, they know that he was on that team. But then if you've seen Moneyball, just because it is a fantastic movie, you would just never know about the best player on the Oakland
Scott
A's.
Hatterberg. Scott Mr. Moneyball, Scott Hatterberg. And I'm like, I mean, if you want to really take Mr. Moneyball, take, I don't know, Barry Zito, Miguel Tejada. I mean, one of those guys definitely need to be promoted, but they're trying to tell a story. They're trying to like it's the underdog story, and saying you have an MVP and a Cy Young on your team
doesn't fit the narrative.
it doesn't, and
It simply
so
doesn't.
you got to go with that. And I mean, like I said, it's lovely for the game, but you gotta make sure that even when you view those stories, you're kind of considering in the back of your mind what actually happened. Just in my personal opinion.
Well, and something kind of funny that ties into that, right? So that team, they have a Cy Young, they have an MVP, and it's partially because they were so successful, right? And then you fast forward, however many years to, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first guy to do it, but the Felix Hernandez Cy Young season. That's really the first season they ever give one of those awards to a guy on a team that's not very good. And he doesn't have a lot of wins. And it took a while, and it took some looking into the actual picture of it all, but we're finally getting there. Now you're seeing DeGrom, 2-time Cy Young winner, been in the playoffs 1 time. You're seeing those guys that deserve awards and deserve the credit, and it's finally starting to reflect in like Gold Gloves and all that. And MVPs post 2015 are finally starting to reflect that too. It's nice to see like guys again be assigned the credit deserved.
Oh, I mean, and absolutely, and I mean, I'll give SaberMetrics credit. That is all SaberMetrics as far as giving a guy without a lot of wins and without a good team Cy Young, because previously they're like, okay, this guy's team do good. If this pitcher did good, this team did good, automatically correlated, right? Like it's just an automatic.
Right?
They had to. And I'm like, it's just not the case. And when they were finally able to articulate value for these guys, and like War, like that's the first stat I mentioned, right? War and like talking and going into, I'm like that being able to correctly value those guys and how many were worth more wins than the other is why teams are no longer, I mean, voters are no longer subject to the conventional inaccurate stats like wins and losses that are incorrectly assigning blame and hurting players that don't deserve to be hurt.
Yeah, like we're
It's
not.
not their fault that their team sucks. They're
Yeah,
just
or
stuck
not
there.
producing runs. I don't remember the number, and I don't want to
Absolutely.
look into it, but like DeGrom in those 2 Cy Young seasons, because I'm pretty sure they were back to back, had like an insanely low. It was like if his team scored 3 runs in all of his starts, he would have not lost a single start. But they didn't do it, and he had a losing record. And
Yep, it was I think I mean last year especially I in my personal fantasy league with some of my buddies, we basically I had Jacob DeGrom, and so he didn't have a great end to the season, but I drafted him for my first round, and it would hurt because a lot of my friends they genuinely believe in a lot of the conventional stats, or and they're somewhat anti sabermetric because they just aren't they just I don't know, they view it as somewhat an attack, so they're like I tried to recommend quality starts, didn't work, but you take guys like DeGrom, right? And he'll put up like an amazing outing over 10 strikeouts, so 6, 7 innings, and he would get the loss. It because he gave up maybe DeGrom has been known he'll give up like a homer, like one
Yeah.
singular homer, maybe like second inning or something, and he did great the rest of the start. He made one bad pitch, and he lost. He got the loss, and I mean in our league that's -5 points. It varies, but it's having guys like that are incorrectly hurt. Like DeGrom is the perfect example that like is on the top of my mind of a guy who sabermetrics has really helped
Yeah.
because it's really been able to show his value when his team can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in the bigger picture of it, when it's all said and done and they're giving out the awards, and just a regular fan who's not really looking deeply into the advanced stats and all that, and just looking at everything that the team has done, oh, this player's on a bad team, he has to suck. He's not good. But having the sabermetrics and the advanced analytics, you could look at the player and be like, all right, cool. Shout out. Good job.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's just again assigning credit where credit's due, and
Yep.
Degrom. I mean, sabermetric wise, when healthy, right?
Biggest
So
thing. Yeah.
that's a big if
Yeah.
nowadays. So when healthy, I mean, easily the best pitcher in baseball.
It's gonna be
100.
cool too because no matter where he ends up, if he ever pitches again or if he's ever as good as he was, however many wins he ends at, he's likely to be the best pitcher with that many wins, just
Yep.
because
No,
of how few he's kind of had.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's he's absurd. I mean, what he can do, and I think that's part of the arm injuries too. Is at his age and stuff like that, I would almost deem it unnatural, and I mean, judging from the injury status and whatnot, unsustainable, frankly, of how fast he's able to throw a pitch, and so I feel like him and his trainers definitely need to work on still being ineffective to a degree, but putting in less effort. He needs to put in less effort into every individual pitch while maintaining some effectiveness. But the way he pitches now, even despite his greatness, it can't be sustained.
Yeah,
I genuinely don't. He will get injured again when he comes healthy. No UCL is meant to take that, man.
a
Our
beating, an
UCLs are
absolute
only meant to
beating.
take so much. And no UCL is designed for an 101 mile per hour Jacob DeGrom fastball mixed with like I mean I mean
His
his off
slider
speed.
hits like 95 sometimes. It's
Yeah, that's what I felt
crazy.
like. His
It's
slider's one of the fast.
crazy.
I'm like he's just like tearing it. Like it's
Yeah,
just I can just almost hear it. I feel like just with how much stress he's putting on that. And I just think his trainers need to be like him like, "Hey Jacob, you're incredible. Maybe if you went to 95% instead of 100 this time, you could, I don't know, maybe save an injury. But
play a
also,
full
I mean,
season.
you give up a couple of more runs, great. You're still one of the best pitchers in the entire MLB.
Yeah,
And it's crazy because baseball is probably the only sport outside of like combat sports with MMA and boxing where like you're putting your body through something that it just should not be doing time after
yeah.
time and after time. And you're just one like pitch away from ca- catastrophe. And it's like, well, that's the name of the game. Keep doing it. But it's the
Yeah.
only sport. Like you don't look at football or basketball or like cricket or tennis or anything like that, golf, that you're at that much risk every time you do what you need
Well,
to do on the field.
well, Joe Burrow behind the Bengals line last year was a
I
lot of
know.
risk. As a Cincinnati guy, that was painful to watch. So I mean, you're right, but like some of those football guys, I'm like every play, that might be
I
his
love that.
last.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember
Especially
him
like
getting
running
30.
backs too. Oof,
Yeah,
some of
running
the hits
backs
they
too. I
get
mean,
scare me.
you had Derrick Henry, right, who was getting 30 plus carries a game. And I mean, and Derrick Henry's line of thinking, right, is the same line of thinking I think with DeGrom. Dude is having to put 100% every play and being absolutely amazing. But when you have as much volume as he does, and like DeGrom being the number one pitcher, right, like you're generally going to get the most innings just based on how the season works. So if a guy like DeGrom putting in the most innings for his team while also exerting the most effort during innings, it's not generally a recipe for sustainable success as
Yeah.
far as injury wise.
Well, and just the more you get hurt, the more likely you are to get hurt
Oh
again.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Guys who were with Tommy John are definitely more likely to get Tommy John again. I mean, it's amazing what the surgery can do, and it creates a new arm. But you'll see guys who have gotten Tommy John 2, 3 times.
Yeah.
Like
I
they
know.
exist
Zach
in the
Britton,
MLB.
he's on his second
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and you got a lot of guys too that are getting Tommy John younger. I mean, I know just from some personal examples. I know some uh, kids that like have played in high school like that I know of that have gotten Tommy John and have gotten on to pitch in the minor leagues, pitch in college, and then eventually go to the majors. So I mean, it's like when you have a lot of the surgeries younger and you're putting a lot more effort on your arm a lot younger, I also think that's another factor we need to be looking deeper into as we evaluate injuries because I feel like when you're hurting your developmental aspect that young, like with a lot of these like little league guys, right? Like I I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't think a 13-year-old should be having to throw 72s, 12-year-olds throwing 70s, 72s. Like that's great and that's awesome. It's highly unnatural and pitching is not a natural motion in itself. And you're going to get a lot of those kids that never be able to have a healthy arm again because they're exerting so much effort when they're young and it's so sustained and it's so constant that their arms are just going to fall apart. And I mean, I think that's what you're getting just with the higher major leagues injury rates in general is that you get guys that are putting so much pressure on themselves at such a young age as far as that. And as they slowly become big leaguers, while and in theory, right, they should be stronger based on muscle, their arms are still, I mean, they're great, but they're also tattered.
Yeah.
They're also injury prone. So, that's a little bit going into medical science, which I'll admit is not my personal area of expertise, but it's something that I really think more teams and even sabermetricians where they can look into more deeply.
Yeah, and there's obviously value in being healthy. Like you can be the best at anything in the world, but if you're not out there doing that thing, how much are you really bringing to us?
And I mean, in the major leagues in general too, right? Like you take like football, right? They don't. A lot of those contracts aren't guaranteed, and so when you get like sports like baseball, where you have a decently high rate of injury, and these guys are still getting paid, whether they are healthy or not, keeping a player healthy is just that more important.
Yep. Football, you can cut a guy. It's like, oh, my O lineman that I signed for a 5-year deal tore his ACL and is never going to be able to block Aaron Donald again. Cool. Hit the road, Jack, and you can gotta just get him out of there, and save millions. Where you can't really do that. So invest in your medical, please. Keep Aaron Judge
Yes.
healthy. Keep
Yes.
Mike Trout
Yes.
healthy,
Yes.
please.
For the love of God.
Please, if and Fernando Tatis, please, no more motorcycles.
No more
Thank you.
motorcycles, dude.
No more. It's
Eloy
I mean, it
Jimenez,
pays
stop
fine.
playing the outfield.
Really?
Just
I mean,
things are preventable sometimes. Let's
yeah,
prevent them.
they really, really are, and it's yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's why That's another aspect of the DH that I was a huge fan of. You got a lot of guys. You're gonna be extending a lot of careers in the National League, which is.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Nelson
It's so
Cruz,
good.
right? I mean, he's like
Granted, he's
42 or
not playing well,
43.
but yeah.
I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong. He's not playing great, but like he's still playing, and I mean, he just extended his career by another year, which I think is pretty cool. You get a lot of guys. I mean, Cincinnati, right? Like Joey Votto.
That was the guy I
Don't
was
get me
thinking
wrong.
of too.
He's horrendous, right? But if he does want to play out of his contract and the Reds want to pay him the major league minimum, which I'll be fine with. If the Reds want to waste a roster spot on Joey Votto for the major league minimum or a little more, I will be completely fine with that. So if they want to do that, put him in the DH, start him occasionally, I think it'd be entertaining. Personally, I mean, not that's not very sabermetric oriented, but I think it'd be having that DH spot to put a guy like that is, I mean, overall like a good thing for the sport.
Yeah, and
That's kind of
it,
another
it it
topic.
brings a couple of the things that aren't very calculable. Like you can't calculate the value that having a former MVP brings, and I don't know how much it is. I don't know. A lot, obviously, a lot of sabermetric guys don't necessarily believe in like clutch or that type of experience, but I do think there is some semblance of value in having Joey Votto on your team, bringing in Josh Donaldson over Gio Urshela, despite them maybe being the same player. Like those things mean
And I
something.
mean, oh, I'm sorry to cut you
No,
off.
you're good. You're good.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, and I mean that brings up another amazing point is that in thinking about sabermetrics and in thinking about baseball, you also need to acknowledge its shortcomings, which it definitely has. The sabermetric field is far from perfect, as is many academic fields just in general. So you got to acknowledge that a clubhouse presence does mean something. I am of the true belief that it does. I feel like it's very hard to articulate. I don't know if we'll ever be able to articulate it,
Probably not.
frankly.
Probably not.
But I mean, like, I remember. I think it was Astro Ball, right? I was reading about. I mean, don't get me wrong, that book aged very poorly with the cheating scandal, but it was still a good book. But it was. I remember they made a big deal of Carlos Beltran being on the team and the value he brought as a mentor to these players and to what that. And I genuinely believe having a mentor like that, a clubhouse presence, does add value. And that's something that Sabermetrics can't hardly articulate because they're assigning value to the individual player. But I mean, the source of that value definitely could have been from a clubhouse presence. You also got to consider the financial factors, right? How much money actually is Joey Votto bringing in? I mean, I know as a Reds fan, Joey Votto is probably like for
The
people who
only
don't
reason
know
to go to a game.
baseball.
The only reason.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people who don't know baseball in Cincinnati, they know who Joey Votto is. I mean, they may not know a single other member of the team, which I have met many fans who don't, or just as far as that, like especially this Reds roster now, they don't know any single member, but they do know who Joey Votto is, and there is value in that.
Yeah, and however you can get value, I think is pretty important.
Yeah.
And obviously, the goal of baseball in terms of it as a sport and entertainment is to make money and provide entertainment. And at the end of the day, if Joey Votto is making my experience better, despite my team being bad, keep him out there. I don't know.
100%, hundred
Yeah.
percent.
But I think we're gonna wrap it up right around there. We're almost at an hour, so I do want to cut that off. But Dylan, I appreciate your time. I love the
Absolutely.
insight that you have, and would
Yeah.
absolutely love to have you back. I hope you had a good time. For,
Absolutely.
and before we get off, just go ahead and promo all of your stuff again. We mentioned it at the top, but where can we find you and all of your stuff at?
So we are on we have a bigger Instagram presence than Twitter, but so we have our website, thedrummyangle.com, and I'm pretty sure they'll probably have my name spelled out correctly somewhere, so I won't really have to spell that out. But so thedrummyangle.com, we market to the more conventional fan to where we try to teach people more about sabermetrics and introduce them to metrics that they may not know to make them smarter about the game. We are on Twitter, and I try to stay active with that. It's a little more difficult, but if you really want to find us, get in contact with us, the most easiest place would be Instagram. That's how I was reached out for this podcast, and that's where we post a lot. We post a lot of baseball content that isn't just on our blog. Also, that we provide a lot of insight on just players we like or fantasy stuff occasionally. But we try to provide knowledge throughout. But yeah, feel free to follow us at the Instagram, same handle at the Drummey Angle. And it's really been a pleasure, guys, doing this, and I've really enjoyed talking baseball with you guys.
Yeah, man, means a lot. Again, appreciate having you on. Make sure you guys go follow him if you don't already. Make sure you follow us at at Spectators Media. Almost said the old at there, at Spectators Media. Check us out on YouTube if you didn't watch this on there, and we'll be back on Monday with a regularly scheduled episode. We'll see you guys next time.
Peace, everybody.